The first hole he dug was so precisely measured that it almost looked ceremonial. Daniel had tied a length of bright orange mason as string around the entire perimeter of his house the night before. It ran in a perfect rectangle, stretched taut between wooden stakes hammered into the ground 3 feet out from the siding. Anyone passing by would have thought he was preparing to pour a foundation for an extension. But there were no concrete forms, no blueprints pinned to the porch railing, no contractor-esque truck parked nearby. Just Daniel. And a shovel. It was early autumn when he started, that time of year when the air is cool but not yet cruel, when the trees glow golden red as if burning slowly from within. The sky was pale and high, and the ground still soft enough to dig without fighting frost. A practical man would have waited until spring for any major project. Daniel had learned that if something was meant to survive winter, it had to be built before winter arrived. The delivery truck came at 8 in the morning. It rumbled down the gravel road and stopped with a hiss of air brakes. Long pressure-treated posts were unloaded first, then bundles of 2x6s, metal brackets, galvanized screws, corrugated metal roofing panels stacked neatly and shining dull silver in the sun. Mrs. Donnelly from across the road paused while watering her front garden. She squinted at the pile. What is he building now? She muttered to no one in particular. Daniel signed the receipt without small talk. The driver left, tires crunching away, and the quiet returned. He stood for a moment looking at the materials. He was, T smiling. He was, T frowning either. He simply studied the house the way a mechanic studies an engine before taking it apart. His house was modest. A 1-story wooden structure built decades ago, square and plain. The paint had once been cream but had faded toward gray. The roof shingles were serviceable but old. The porch sagged just slightly on the left side, something Daniel had meant to fix for years. The house had survived many winters, but survival was the same as efficiency. He walked to the first marked corner and drove his shovel into the soil. The sound was dull and satisfying. He dug steadily, scooping earth aside in rhythmic motions. The hole was not random. It was measured exactly 24 inches deep. He moved to the next mark. By mid-morning, Carl from next door leaned over the chain-link fence. "Morning, Dan. You building a moat?" Daniel did. Till looked up immediately. He tamped the bottom of the hole flat with the end of his shovel. "Morning." Carl waited, setting posts. For what? Daniel wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "You'll see." Carl laughed lightly. "As long as it's not a spaceship." Daniel allowed the smallest flicker of a smile, then returned to digging. The second hole, the third, the fourth. He worked clockwise around the house. Each hole was exactly 3 feet from the siding, measured carefully with a tape before digging. He double-checked the alignment against the string line. He was not building randomly. The spacing between posts was uniform, 6 feet apart, no more, no less. By noon, 4 posts stood upright in their holes, braced temporarily with scrap boards. Daniel mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow and poured it around each base, checking with the level to ensure perfect vertical alignment. It began to look strange almost immediately. The posts were not attached to the house. They stood separate, forming a second invisible perimeter around it. It was as if he were building a skeletal fence that hugged the house but never touched it. Mrs. Donnelly crossed the street under the pretense of returning an empty pie dish she had borrowed weeks ago. "Daniel," she said warmly, holding out the dish. "Thought I'd bring this back." "Thank you." She glanced around. "Are you expanding?" "Not exactly." "Oh," she hesitated. "It goes all the way around." "Yes, that S. Interesting." He could hear the politeness in her voice, the kind people use when they don't understand something but don't want to be rude. "It'll make sense later," he said simply. She nodded, unconvinced, and walked back across the road. Within minutes, her phone was at her ear. By late afternoon, 8 posts stood firmly set in concrete along the front and one side of the house. The emerging shape was undeniable now. It encircled the structure. Carl returned, this time with a beer in hand. "You sure about this, Dan? You were boxing yourself in." Daniel tightened a temporary brace. "No doors are blocked." "That's not what I mean." Daniel knew what he meant. People valued openness, space, clean sightlines. The idea of surrounding one's house with another structure felt confining, almost offensive. But Daniel had grown up in colder places than this town. He had lived in a farmhouse where winter winds slipped through wall seams like fingers searching for weakness. He remembered mornings when frost formed on the inside of windows. He remembered stacking wood in snow so deep it reached his knees. He also remembered how his grandfather had once stacked hay bales around a shed during an especially brutal winter, not because it looked good, but because it worked. The memory lingered. By sunset, he had completed the first full side. 10 posts in total stood upright, forming a straight line parallel to the house. The gap between the house wall and the posts was uniform, creating a corridor of empty space. From above, it would have looked like a house wearing a loose wooden collar. He packed his tools away carefully. Daniel was not the type to leave a mess overnight. Order mattered. Precision mattered. Inside the house, he sat at the small kitchen table with a notebook open. Numbers filled the page, rough calculations of lumber quantities, airflow gaps, wind angles, snowfall averages. He had done this math weeks ago, but he reviewed it again anyway. He was improvising. He was preparing. The next morning, he rose before sunrise. The air was colder now, sharp enough to make his breath visible. He resumed digging along the backside of the house. Word had spread overnight. 2 teenagers walking to the bus stop slowed and whispered, "It is like he's building a cage. Maybe he's hiding something." Daniel ignored them. He worked steadily. Each post set. Each measurement verified twice. By midday, the entire perimeter was marked by vertical posts. They formed a complete rectangle around the house, separated by a consistent 3-foot gap. It looked absurd, like a second skeleton waiting for skin. Carl leaned against the fence again. "You could have just built a regular shed in the backyard." "I need it in the backyard." "So why wrap the house?" Daniel paused, considering whether to explain. "Because the house is the problem." Carl blinked. "The house looks fine." "Looks," Daniel said quietly, then went back to work. By the 3rd day, he began attaching horizontal beams at the top of the posts, connecting them together. The frame stiffened. The shape became undeniable. It was not a fence. It was a structure. He added cross-bracing for stability. Then angled rafters extending outward from the house wall to the top beam of the new outer frame. They did not connect directly to the house siding. Instead, they were anchored just beneath the eaves, carefully sealed to prevent leaks. The slope was subtle but deliberate. Rain would run away from the house, not toward it. When the first section of corrugated metal roofing went up, the effect changed dramatically. Suddenly there was shade along one side of the house. A narrow covered walkway had formed. Mrs. Donnelly stood on her porch and stared openly now. "It's like he's building a roof around a roof," she said to her husband. The metallic panels reflected pale sunlight. They made a hollow ringing sound when screwed into place. The noise carried down the street. Daniel worked methodically. He wore gloves to prevent cuts from the metal edges. Each panel overlapped precisely one ridge over the next, ensuring watertightness. As he circled the house installing roofing, the corridor took shape. 3 feet wide, covered overhead, open on the outside, and separated from the house by a small but consistent gap. It was neither indoors nor fully outdoors. It was something in between. On the 5th day, the laughter began more openly. A passing pickup truck slowed, and someone shouted, "Building a barn around your barn." Daniel did respond. Another neighbor joked, "Planning for zombies?" Daniel tightened another bolt. He did not build for applause, he built for January. Inside, he had already rearranged furniture slightly to maximize interior heat circulation. He had sealed minor drafts around window frames weeks earlier. He had inspected the wood stove, flue, and cleaned it thoroughly. The structure outside was only one part of the plan. By the end of the week, the shed-like frame completely surrounded the house. It stood solid, squared, and aligned. It looked strange. There was no denying that. A house normally stands alone, clear walls, direct exposure, defined edges. This house now had a buffer, a breathing space, an intentional gap between itself and the world. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel stood at the front yard and studied the result. The metal roof formed a continuous ring. The posts were anchored firmly. The corridor was dry and shaded. It was only the skeleton. The real work would come next. Carl walked over, this time without joking. "You really thought this through, did you?" Daniel nodded. "What is next?" Daniel looked at the empty corridor that wrapped around his home. "Next," he said calmly, "I fill it." Carl frowned slightly. "With what?" Daniel did answer immediately. His eyes moved to the neatly stacked firewood pile at the edge of his yard. Split, seasoned, ready. He turned back toward the house. "You'll see." And for the first time, though no one else understood it yet, Daniel felt the quiet confidence of a man who was reacting to winter. He was preparing to control it. By the time the outer frame was fully upright and the metal roofing sealed into place, the structure had become the town's favorite topic of conversation. It did, to matter where you went. The hardware store, the small grocery near the highway, even the church parking lot on Sunday, someone would bring it up. "You've seen what Daniel's building. It goes all the way around his house. Whole thing looks like it's wearing scaffolding." The laughter was cruel at first. It was casual. Curious. The kind of amusement people feel when something disrupts the familiar shape of their street. Daniel's house had always been unremarkable. Plain siding, small porch, a square roofline. It blended in. Now it did. The new structure changed the silhouette entirely. From the road, the house no longer had clean edges. It appeared layered, almost doubled. In the late afternoon, shadows from the outer posts striped the siding in long vertical bars. The metal roof glinted faintly under the sun. It looked unfinished. It looked temporary. And most importantly, it did look like anything people were used to seeing. Daniel was aware of the attention. He noticed cars slowing slightly as they passed. He caught glimpses of neighbors pointing discreetly. Once, he stepped outside to grab a tool and saw two people standing on the sidewalk across the road taking a photo. He did react. He had grown up in a small farming town where innovation was often mistaken for eccentricity. He knew that anything unfamiliar triggered two instincts in people: laughter or suspicion, sometimes both. Inside the local hardware store, Carl leaned against the counter while waiting for a paint order. "I'm telling you," he said to the clerk, "it wraps the entire house. Like he's building a second skin." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "For insulation?" Carl shrugged. If that's what it is, he could have just insulated the walls like normal people. Daniel entered the store just as Carl finished speaking. The room fell quiet for a second too long. Daniel walked calmly to the lumber aisle. He picked up additional brackets and a box of heavy-duty exterior screws. He also grabbed several rolls of breathable weather barrier fabric. Carl cleared his throat. "Morning, Dan." "Morning." "So what is phase 2? Carl asked, trying to sound casual. Daniel placed the supplies on the counter. "Reinforcement." "For what?" "For winter." Carl chuckled lightly. "You planning for the Arctic?" Daniel looked at him evenly. "It comes here every year." There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness. Just certainty. That certainty unsettled people more than anything. Over the next several days, Daniel continued refining the structure. He added horizontal support beams midway between the posts, creating rectangular sections. Then he began attaching evenly spaced slats along the outer frame, not solid boards, but boards with deliberate gaps between them. The spacing was precise, 2 inches between each slat. From the street, it started to look less skeletal and more intentional. But the gaps confused people even more. If he wanted a wall, why leave holes? He is doing it wrong. Wind's going to blow right through that. Daniel heard the comments when he stepped outside. Sometimes they weren't, he even whispered. People felt comfortable criticizing openly because the project seemed so obviously misguided. One afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly approached him again. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said gently, "but doesn't this block sunlight from your windows?" Daniel wiped sawdust from his hands. "Not enough to matter. The sun's higher in summer, lower in winter." She frowned slightly. "I don't follow." "In winter," he explained calmly, "the sun sits lower in the sky. Its light will pass under the roof edge and through the slats. In summer, when it is high and harsh, the overhang will provide shade." She blinked. "You calculated that?" I measured. There was no pride in his voice, only fact. As he worked, he made subtle adjustments most people did notice. He ensured that the slope of the outer roof directed rainwater far enough away from the foundation. He installed small gravel trenches at key drainage points. He left ventilation gaps near the top beam to allow rising warm air to escape. This was not random carpentry. This was design. But design is often invisible until tested. By the end of the second week, the corridor felt defined. It was wide enough to walk through comfortably, but narrow enough to feel purposeful. The metal roofing muffled the sound of light rain when it came. The ground beneath remained dry. Daniel stood inside the corridor one evening during a drizzle and simply listened. The rain struck the outer roof and slid down cleanly. None of it touched the house walls. The siding remained dry. He ran his fingers along the wood paneling. Dry. He stepped back inside the house and waited. Within an hour, he noticed something subtle. The interior temperature did drop as quickly as it normally did after sunset. It was a small difference, but noticeable. Outside, the town's commentary grew sharper. At the diner downtown, someone said, "He must have spent a fortune on lumber." Another replied, "All to build a fancy walkway." A third chimed in, "Bet it collapses under snow." Daniel did attend those conversations, but the words traveled. Carl's attitude shifted from amusement to mild concern. "You are sure this thing can handle snow load?" he asked one afternoon, tapping a post experimentally. Daniel nodded. "Rated for more than we get." "You reinforced the rafters?" "Yes." Carl glanced at the open slats again. Still don't see why it needs to go all the way around. Daniel looked toward the north side of his house, the side that faced the strongest winter winds. That side gets hit hardest, he said. Wind strips heat away faster than cold alone. Carl frowned. You think this'll stop wind? It won't stop it, Daniel replied. It'll slow it. The distinction mattered. Wind did need to be eliminated to reduce heat loss. It only needed to be disrupted, but explaining that would require a longer conversation than Carl was ready for. By early October, the leaves had begun to fall in earnest. The corridor collected a few at first, but Daniel swept them out daily. He did not allow debris to accumulate. Clean lines, clear airflow. One evening, a group of teenagers walked by again. One of them ran his hand along the slats. Feels like a maze. It's stupid, another said. Why not just build a bigger house? Daniel was stacking additional bracing supports nearby. He paused. Because I don't need a bigger house, he said calmly. I need a smarter one. The teenagers exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or not. They walked on. Inside, Daniel reviewed last winter as heating bills again. He remembered the week in January when temperatures dropped below freezing for days straight. His stove had burned nearly nonstop. He had stacked wood outside in the open, fighting snow accumulation. Each log he brought in carried moisture. Each gust of wind pressed cold directly against his siding. Heat escaped faster than it could accumulate. That would not happen this year. As the structure stood complete but empty, people began assuming that perhaps this was the final version. Some eccentric covered walkway that served no clear purpose. Maybe he just likes projects. Someone said at the grocery checkout, maybe he's bored. But Daniel was far from bored. He was patient. One Saturday morning, a new delivery arrived. Not lumber this time. A full cord of seasoned hardwood. Then another, and another. The truck driver looked puzzled as Daniel directed him. Stack it near the front, Daniel said. I'll move it from there. You got a shed? The driver asked. Daniel glanced at the corridor around his house. Something like that. As the driver left, Carl approached again, eyes widening at the volume of wood. You stocking up for 10 winters? Daniel picked up the first armful of logs and stepped into the corridor. This winter, he said quietly, I want to be caught unprepared. Carl watched as Daniel began stacking the wood along the inside of the outer frame. Not randomly, not loosely, but tightly, methodically, building upward layer by layer. The corridor was no longer empty, and for the first time the town's laughter softened, replaced by curiosity. Because now it looked deliberate. Now, it looked like part of a plan. Daniel stacked until sunset that day, creating a neat wall of wood between each set of posts. The logs were arranged bark side outward, split faces inward. Air could still move through the 2-inch gaps in the slats. Moisture would escape, but wind would be disrupted. Carl leaned closer to the fence, watching the pattern form. You were insulating with firewood. Daniel adjusted a log to fit snugly. Yes. Carl blinked slowly. That's actually clever. Daniel did smile. He simply continued stacking. The town was convinced yet, but doubt had begun to replace mockery, and doubt Daniel knew was the first crack in certainty. Winter ones here yet, but it was coming. And when it did, the structure that looked foolish under autumn sunlight would face its real test. Until then, Daniel would keep building, not for approval, not for applause, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that preparation often looks strange before it looks wise. The first row of firewood changed the way the structure felt. Up until that moment, the corridor had seemed like an unfinished thought, a wooden ring with potential but no purpose visible to the eye. But when Daniel placed the first log carefully between 2 posts, aligning it flush against the inner support beam, the idea began to take shape in physical form. He did not toss the wood casually. Each piece was inspected, turned in his hands, and set deliberately. The split faces went inward toward the house. The bark faced outward toward the slatted wall. The pieces were chosen for fit as much as for size. Smaller splits filled gaps. Larger logs anchored the base. He began at the north side of the house. That was intentional. The north side took the brunt of the winter wind every year. It was where frost lingered longest in the mornings. It was where snow piled highest against the siding. Daniel had watched it for years, how wind wrapped around the corner and pressed hot against that wall like an uninvited hand trying to push inside. If there was a weakness in the house, it was there. So he built his wall of wood where it mattered most. The first layer rose slowly. Kneeling on the dry ground beneath the metal roof, Daniel aligned the base logs tightly along the gravel. he had laid earlier to prevent moisture from wicking upward. He left a narrow air gap between the firewood and the siding, just enough space for ventilation, not enough to allow wind to rush through freely. Air would move, but it would move slower. That was the point. By mid-morning, a waist-high line of wood stretched along the north wall. It looked solid, dense, purposeful. Carl wandered over again, drawn by the rhythmic sound of wood being set into place. "You are serious about this," he said. Daniel did look up. "Always was." Carl crouched and examined the stack. "One that attract pests." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Not if it is dry. Not if it is elevated off soil. Not if airflow is controlled." Carl ran a hand along the bark. "Still seems risky." Daniel stood and brushed off his jeans. "So is letting heat escape every winter." Carl did, to have a response to that. By afternoon, Daniel had built the north wall nearly to shoulder height. The corridor began to feel narrower now, enclosed by the growing mass of wood. The scent of seasoned oak and maple filled the air, dry, clean, faintly sweet. He stepped back to assess. The visual effect was striking. What had looked like a skeletal frame now resembled a deliberate outer shell. The firewood formed a thick barrier, roughly 2 feet deep from the slats inward. The gap between the wood and the house remained intact. He measured it again. 6 inches. Perfect, enough for airflow, enough to prevent moisture buildup against the siding, enough to create a trapped buffer zone of air that would resist rapid temperature swings. He resumed stacking. Neighbors passed by slowly, pretending not to stare. Mrs. Donnelly paused again, this time longer than usual. "Oh my," she murmured. "It is becoming a wall." Daniel nodded politely. "All the way around?" she asked. "All the way." She tilted her head. "That's a lot of wood." "Yes. For burning?" "Eventually." The word lingered in the air. Eventually, but not immediately. That was the detail most people missed. Daniel ones. Just storing firewood. He was deploying it. By the 3rd day of stacking, the north side was complete. The wood rose nearly to the underside of the roofline, leaving a narrow ventilation gap at the top. He secured it with a horizontal brace to prevent shifting. Then he moved clockwise. The west side came next, the side that caught late afternoon winds and driving sleet. He worked steadily, almost meditatively. Lift. Place. Adjust. Step back. Repeat. His movements were efficient, but never rushed. Precision mattered more than speed. If the wall was uneven, air pressure would exploit it. If gaps were too large, wind would penetrate too easily. If stacked too tight without ventilation, moisture could linger. Balance, that was what he built. Inside the house that evening, Daniel lit a small fire in the stove, even though the temperature outside was only mildly cool. He wanted to test something. He sat at the kitchen table, thermometer in hand, and waited. Heat radiated from the stove and filled the room. He walked to the north wall and placed his hand near the interior paneling. Usually, he would feel a faint chill there, once the fire died down. Tonight, the warmth lingered longer, not dramatically, but measurably. He wrote the numbers down. Outside, the half-built wood wall stood silent in the fading light. At the diner that week, the tone of conversation shifted subtly. "He is stacking it tight," someone observed. "I drove by. Looks solid. Still strange. Maybe. But it's not sloppy." Curiosity replaced mockery. Daniel did attend those discussions, but he sensed the shift. The glances were less amused now, more analytical. As the days passed, the wall grew. The east side took shape under his hands. Morning sunlight filtered through the slats, casting striped shadows across the stacked logs. Dust motes floated in the golden light. He adjusted his stacking pattern slightly on this side to allow more sun penetration in winter. The lower sun angle would shine through the slats and warm the outer layer of wood during the day. That stored warmth would radiate slowly into the air gap after sunset. It wasn't guesswork. It was observation. Carlo returned one afternoon with a notebook. "Mind if I ask something?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Go ahead. You leaving that gap between the wood and the house on purpose?" "Yes. Why not press it tight against the siding? Would that insulate better?" Daniel leaned against a post. "If it touches, moisture transfers. Rot risk increases. Also, trapped condensation would reduce insulation value." Carl scribbled something down. "You've thought about airflow?" Daniel nodded. "Air is insulation," he said simply, "still air." Carl looked at the stack again. "And wind ruins that?" "Yes. So you were slowing wind before it reaches the house?" "Yes." Carl closed the notebook slowly. "That's actually smart." Daniel offered no expression of satisfaction. He simply lifted another log and continued. By the time he completed 3 sides, The house looked entirely transformed. The outer ring of wood created a visual mass that made the house appear fortified. Not aggressively, but solidly. From a distance, it resembled an old-world structure designed for harsh climates. The laughter was gone now. In its place were thoughtful silences. One evening, a storm rolled through unexpectedly. Strong autumn winds pushed against the neighborhood. Leaves swirled violently. Trash cans tipped over. Daniel stepped outside into the corridor. He stood between the stacked wood and the siding and listened. The wind struck the outer slats first, losing force as it passed through narrow gaps. It hit the thick firewood barrier and diffused further. By the time it reached the inner air gap near the siding, it was reduced to a soft current. The house itself felt calmer, quieter. He placed his palm against the interior wall later that night. Less vibration, less chill. He nodded slightly. The test had begun. Over the next week, Daniel finished the final side, the south wall, where winter sun would be strongest. Here, he left slightly wider ventilation gaps between certain sections, calculated to allow solar warming without exposing the siding to direct wind. He secured the entire ring with additional braces, ensuring no shifting under snow load. Then he stepped back and looked at the result. His house was wrapped in wood, not randomly, not chaotically, but deliberately. The corridor no longer felt like a walkway. It felt like a buffer zone, a transitional space between environment and shelter. Mrs. Donnelly approached again, slower this time. "It's beautiful," she admitted quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "I mean, not in the usual way, but it feels strong." He considered that. "Strength doesn't always look pretty," he said. She smiled, faintly. "People aren't laughing anymore." Daniel glanced down the road. He had noticed. What once seemed foolish now appeared thoughtful. Neighbors who once joked now slowed to study details. A few even walked the perimeter, examining airflow gaps and roof slope. One man from 2 streets over knocked on Daniel's door. "Mind if I take measurements?" he asked sheepishly. Daniel handed him a tape measure without hesitation. Winter hadn't arrived yet, but anticipation had. As temperatures dipped lower in late October, Daniel continued small refinements. He sealed minor cracks, reinforced joints, checked drainage. Then, on the first cold night of the season, he performed a final test. He lit his stove and allowed the fire to burn down slowly. Normally, by early morning, the house would feel cold enough to wake him. He would rise before dawn to restart the fire. This time, he slept through the night. When he woke, the interior temperature had dropped, but not nearly as sharply as previous years. The buffer worked. The wood, warmed slightly by the previous day, sun and by residual heat escaping the siding, released warmth gradually into the trapped air corridor. The slowed wind reduced convective heat loss. The dry environment prevented dampness from stealing warmth. It was subtle, but real. Daniel brewed coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out through the slats at the quiet street. No one was laughing now. The structure had transformed from spectacle to statement, not a statement of defiance, but of preparation. Carl walked by later that morning and paused. "How's it holding?" Daniel opened the door and stepped into the corridor. "Come feel." Carl placed his hand on the siding inside the air gap. "It's not as cold." Daniel nodded. "Told you," he said calmly. Carl exhaled slowly. "Guess we'll see when the real winter hits." Daniel looked up at the sky, pale and heavy with the promise of coming snow. "Yes," he said quietly. "We will." And as the final leaves fell and frost began to silver the grass, each morning, the wall of wood stood firm, not just as storage, not just as insulation, but as quiet proof that preparation often looks strange before it proves wise. The first real snowfall arrived in the middle of the night. It began as a whisper against the metal roofing, a faint ticking that blended with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft settling sounds of an old house cooling in darkness. Daniel woke briefly when the sound changed, when the whisper thickened into a steady hush. He lay still in bed, listening. Snow had a way of silencing the world. Even before he looked outside, he could feel the difference. The air felt heavier, quieter, insulated. By morning, the town was transformed. 8 inches of wet, heavy snow blanketed rooftops, cars, fences, and trees. Branches sagged under the weight. The road was pale and smooth except for 2 early tire tracks cutting through. Daniel rose slowly and walked to the kitchen window. He expected what he always saw on mornings like this: snow piled directly against his siding, pressed into corners by wind, clinging stubbornly to the lower half of the house. Instead, he saw something different. The outer metal roof had caught the snowfall first. The sloped panels directed the accumulation outward. Snow slid cleanly off the edges, forming a soft ridge several feet away from the house foundation. The corridor beneath the roof remained mostly clear. He stepped into his boots, opened the back door, and entered the narrow passage between his siding and the stacked firewood. It was dry, not perfectly. A few flakes had blown in through the slats, but the ground was not buried. The wood stacks were untouched by snow. The siding behind them was protected from direct contact. He walked the entire perimeter slowly. On the north side, where wind usually forced snow hard against the house, the outer slats and firewood had taken the impact. Snow rested along the outer wall, but the inner air gap remained open. He knelt and placed his hand against the siding. Cold, yes, but not soaked, not pressed under wet weight. He stood and looked outward through the slats at the street. Across the road, Mrs. Donnelly was already shoveling her walkway. Snow clung to the base of her house in uneven piles. The wind had pushed it up against the siding overnight. Carl emerged from his front door, rubbing his hands together against the cold. He looked toward Daniel's house and paused mid-step. Daniel gave a small nod. Carl stared at the ridge of snow several feet away from Daniel's foundation. Then at his own house, where snow hugged the walls like a heavy blanket. He shook his head once, slowly. Daniel returned inside and lit his stove. The fire caught easily. Dry wood ignited cleanly and quickly. There was no need to brush snow from logs or chip ice away from frozen bark. He had simply stepped into the corridor, lifted a few pieces from the stack, and carried them in. No wet sleeves, no slipping ice. He closed the stove door and waited. The temperature inside began rising steadily. What he noticed most was how fast it warmed. It was how stable it felt. The drafts that usually whispered near the baseboards were muted. The north wall did not radiate the biting chill it once had during early storms. Outside, the neighborhood struggled through the first winter test. By noon, shoveling had turned into complaining. This snow is heavy. Feels colder than usual. My furnace hasn't. He stopped running. Carl knocked on Daniel's door around mid-afternoon. You got a minute. Daniel opened the door, and Carl stepped inside, stamping snow off his boots. It is warmer than I expected, Carl admitted, glancing around. Daniel poured him a cup of coffee. How much wood you burned so far? Carl asked. Not much. Carl frowned. You usually burn steady on days like this. Daniel nodded. Usually. Carl took a sip and stared toward the north wall. You think that wall of wood is actually doing something? Daniel did. T answer immediately. He walked to the thermometer on the wall and tapped it lightly. Temperature dropped 5 degrees overnight, he said. Last year on the first storm like this, it dropped 11. Carl's eyebrows rose. 5? He repeated. Daniel nodded. Carl leaned back slowly. Huh. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of the stove. Outside, wind began picking up. Snow lifted from the ground in thin, swirling sheets. It struck the outer slats with a soft hiss. Daniel excused himself and stepped back into the corridor. The wind was stronger now, pushing snow sideways instead of downward. It hit the outer slats first, scattering in small plumes as it passed through the narrow gaps. The firewood barrier behind it absorbed the force, breaking the gust into smaller, slower currents before it could reach the inner air gap. He stood between the siding and the stacked logs and felt it. There was movement, yes, but not pressure. That was the difference. In previous winters, wind slammed directly against his siding, forcing cold air into microscopic cracks, increasing convective heat loss. Now, the energy of that wind was dissipated before reaching the house. He returned inside, brushing a few flakes from his jacket. Carl was still staring at the wall. You were slowing the wind, Carl said quietly. Yes, and keeping snow from packing against the siding. Yes. Carl exhaled slowly. I laughed too soon. Daniel shrugged slightly. Most people did. That evening, temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. The sky cleared, and the snow reflected moonlight in a pale glow. Daniel reduced the stove's intake and let the fire burn lower than he normally would on a night like this. He wanted to test the retention further. He woke once around midnight out of habit. The house was still warm enough to remain under the blankets comfortably. He did, to get up to add wood. In the morning, frost coated the windows of neighboring houses. Chimneys smoked heavily as furnaces and stoves worked overtime. Daniel's chimney emitted a thin, steady plume. He stepped outside again and walked the perimeter. The snow ridge around the outer edge had thickened. It formed a natural barrier now, insulating the lower section of the slatted wall even further. The corridor remained mostly clear, protected by the roof and by the bulk of the wood itself. He pressed his palm against the siding again. Cold, yes, but steady, not damp. He checked for condensation in the air gap. Minimal. Airflow was working. Over the next week, temperatures fluctuated wildly. One day it hovered just below freezing. The next plunged deep into the 20s. Wind gusts reached 30 miles per hour during a brief cold front. Each time, Daniel monitored. He tracked interior temperatures morning and night. He measured wood consumption carefully. He compared notes with last year's records. The difference was undeniable. He was burning less. Not dramatically less yet, but noticeably. Enough that he could see the stack shrinking slower than usual. Word began spreading again, but the tone had changed. It stayed warmer inside. His snow isn't packed against the house? He hasn't been chopping ice off his woodpile? Mrs. Donnelly visited one afternoon wrapped in a thick scarf. I noticed something, she said softly as she stepped into the corridor. Daniel waited. My siding feels wet after storms. Yours does too. He nodded. Roof keeps direct precipitation off. And the wood blocks the wind. Yes. She ran her hand along the stacked logs. It's like you built a coat. Daniel considered that. Yes, he said after a moment. A coat? Another storm hit in early December, heavier, wetter, and driven by fierce wind. Snow fell nearly sideways for hours. The town experienced brief power outages. Tree limbs snapped under weight. Daniel stood once more inside his corridor while the storm raged. Snow hammered the outer slats. The metal roof rang under impact. But inside the air gap near the siding, it felt muted, almost calm. He felt a quiet satisfaction. This was the test he had built for. When the storm cleared, the contrast between his house and others became obvious. Snowbanks rose high against neighboring foundations. Icicles formed along exposed siding edges. Wet snow clung and began melting slowly during brief daytime thaws, only to refreeze overnight. Daniel's siding remained mostly dry, his foundation clear. Carl stood at the fence again, staring openly now. Okay, he said bluntly, it works. Daniel smiled faintly. Carl shook his head. I should have seen it. Daniel leaned against a post. People see what they expect, he said, not what is new. Carl laughed quietly. You planning to patent this? Daniel shrugged. It is just physics. But physics, applied carefully, felt almost like magic to those who hadn't, he considered it. By mid-December, heating bills arrived. Carl knocked on Daniel's door again, envelope in hand. You won't believe this, Carl said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. My usage is higher than last year already. Daniel nodded slowly. Mine is lower, he replied. Carl blinked. Already? Daniel gestured toward the wall, buffer. Carl looked thoughtful. That night, Daniel added only a few pieces of wood to his stove before bed. He lay awake briefly, listening not to wind, but to the absence of it. The house no longer groaned under pressure. The drafts had softened into whispers. The warmth felt steady rather than fleeting. He remembered the laughter from early autumn, the jokes. The head shakes. They seemed distant now. Outside, his house stood wrapped in wood and shadow under the winter sky, not flashy, not dramatic, but resilient. And as another cold front rolled across the region, bringing sub-zero wind chills to the town, Daniel slept through the night again without waking to feed the fire. When he rose in the morning, frost covered the fields beyond the houses like powdered glass. He walked the corridor one more time, boots crunching lightly on thin ice. The wood was dry. The siding was protected. The wind, though still present, felt distant. For the first time in years, winter did not feel like an opponent. It felt like something contained. And in the quiet stillness of that snow-covered morning, as chimney smoke drifted gently upward instead of violently sideways, Daniel understood something simple and certain. Preparation does shout. It endures. By midwinter, the novelty of the structure had worn off, but the results had not. January arrived with the kind of cold that settles into the bones of a town and refuses to leave. The sky turned a pale, metallic gray for days at a time. Snowbanks hardened into ridges of ice along driveways. Breath hung in the air long after being exhaled. Doors creaked differently. Engines complained before starting. This was the stretch of winter that usually tested everyone. It was when heating systems ran nearly nonstop, when propane deliveries were delayed, when wood piles shrank faster than expected, when people began calculating how much of the season was left, and whether their supplies would last. Daniel had lived through enough of these months to know their rhythm. There was always an early snowfall that felt almost charming. Then came a deeper freeze. But January was endurance. On the first morning of the cold snap, the thermometer outside his kitchen window read 9 degrees. 9, the kind of number that usually meant feeding the stove heavily before sunrise and again before bed. The kind of cold that made the north wall feel like a slab of stone if you leaned against it. Daniel rose before dawn, out of habit, and stepped quietly into the corridor to collect wood. The air in the passage was cold. Yes, but not biting. The wind was howling across the open fields beyond the houses, yet inside the corridor, the gusts felt filtered, diffused. Snow had drifted against the outer slats in soft waves, but the stacked firewood held firm behind them. The air gap near the siding remained clear. He ran his hand along the wood. Dry. He pulled 3 logs from the stack and carried them inside. Normally, during a 9-degree morning, he would bring in twice that amount just to prepare. Today, he decided to test further. He lit a modest fire and waited. The stove warmed steadily. The room filled with a slow, even heat rather than a desperate blast meant to chase away a deep chill. He walked to the north wall and placed his palm against it. Cool, but not frigid. He had begun noticing something subtle over the past few weeks, not just that the house stayed warmer, but that the temperature drop overnight was less dramatic. The peaks and valleys had softened. Instead of wild swings between hot near the stove and cold near the walls, the warmth felt distributed more evenly. The buffer was stabilizing the environment. Around mid-morning, Carl knocked again, this time without preamble. "You seen the temperature?" Carl asked, as soon as Daniel opened the door. 9. It hit 7 at my place. Daniel stepped aside and let him in. Carl stamped snow from his boots and rubbed his hands together. "Feels warmer in here than it should," Carl muttered. Daniel poured coffee without comment. "My furnace ran almost all night," Carl continued. "Could get ahead of the cold. Wind is cutting right through." Daniel nodded slightly. "It is strong." Carl walked toward the north wall instinctively, as if drawn to it now whenever he entered. "You mind if I check something?" Carl asked. Daniel gestured toward the wall. Carl placed his hand flat against the paneling and left it there. "It is not radiating cold like mine does," he said slowly. "No." Carl stepped back, looking thoughtful rather than amused now. "How much wood you burned overnight?" Daniel considered. "About half what I usually would on a night like this." Carl stared at him. "Half?" "Yes." Carl let out a low whistle. "That's not small." Daniel shrugged lightly. "It adds up." And that was the realization that began to ripple outward. Not the visual oddity of the structure, not even the comfort difference inside the house, but the arithmetic. Firewood cost time, effort, and money. Cutting, splitting, stacking, hauling. Propane and electric heating cost cash. When usage dropped by even 20%, the impact compounded over a season. By the second week of January, Daniel had burned noticeably less than he normally would have by that point in winter. The stack in the corridor had shrunk, yes, but slowly, methodically. And every piece he removed had been dry. He hadn't once stepped into deep snow to retrieve wood. He hadn't brushed off ice or chopped apart frozen logs stuck together by sleet. He hadn't carried dripping pieces into the house that hissed and steamed in the stove before finally catching fire. Each log he brought and ignited cleanly and efficiently. That efficiency mattered. Wet wood wastes heat. Energy is spent evaporating moisture before combustion can produce meaningful warmth. Dry wood, stored under cover and shielded from precipitation, burns hotter and cleaner. Daniel had always known this. Now he was living it daily. Word spread quietly but steadily. At the diner, someone mentioned, "Daniel's using less wood this year." Another replied, "I drove past. Snow's not even touching his siding." A third added, "My back wall, soaked from melt and refreeze. His looks dry." The laughter was gone entirely now. In its place was calculation. One afternoon, Mr. Alvarez from 2 streets over knocked on Daniel S.'s door. "Hope I am not bothering you," he said politely. "Not at all. I was wondering, could you explain how wide that corridor is?" 3 feet. "And the wood stack?" "About 2 feet deep, leaving 6 inches to the siding." Mr. Alvarez nodded, absorbing every detail. "And airflow?" "Important," Daniel said. "Don't seal it airtight. Slow wind. Don't trap moisture." Mr. Alvarez looked impressed. "You engineered this." Daniel hesitated. "I observed," he corrected. By late January, the cold deepened again. This time, wind chills dropped below 0 overnight. Daniel prepared, as usual, a modest fire before bed, vents adjusted. Carefully, not overfeeding the stove. He lay awake for a moment, listening to the wind hit the outer slats. It sounded different now, not like something attacking the house, but like something brushing against a shield. He slept through until morning. When he woke, the indoor temperature had dropped, but gently. Manageably. The stove still held embers. He added a single log. Just one. He stood there watching it catch flame and felt something unexpected, not pride, not triumph, but calm. Winter no longer felt like a race against depletion. It felt paced. Meanwhile, Across the street, Mrs. Donnelly struggled with frozen pipes along her exterior wall. Snow had melted slightly during a brief, sunny afternoon and refrozen overnight, pressing dampness into seams. Daniel helped her wrap insulation and suggested diverting snow away from her foundation. "You might consider a covered wood stack against that side," he offered. "Carefully." She smiled faintly. "I might consider something more dramatic next year." By February, the financial difference became clearer. Heating bills arrived again. Carl walked over, envelope in hand, shaking his head. "You are not going to believe this," he said. Daniel opened his own bill first, lower than last January, significantly lower. Carl opened his, higher. "I don't get it," Carl muttered. "Colder year. Should be higher for everyone." Daniel nodded slowly. "It is." Carl looked toward the corridor. "You cut yours almost 30%. Close." Carl exhaled sharply. "That is not insulation foam. That is not new windows. That is wood stacked outside." Daniel leaned against the doorway. "It's about layers," he said quietly. "Break the wind. Keep moisture off. Stabilize air." Carl stared at the slatted outer wall. "Most of us fight winter from inside," he said slowly. "You fought it from outside." Daniel considered that phrasing. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Exactly. That was the shift, the realization. The house itself hadn't changed dramatically. The stove was the same, the siding the same, the foundation unchanged, but the relationship between the house and the environment had been altered. Instead of absorbing the full force of winter directly, the house now had an intermediary, a sacrificial layer, a buffer that took the brunt of wind, snow, and moisture before those forces reached the actual structure. And that buffer served a second purpose: storing fuel. It was insulation that could later be burned, functional twice over. By the third week of February, something else became apparent. The exterior siding of Daniel's house looked better than it usually did at that point in winter. No streaks from meltwater, no darkened damp patches, no ice clinging to lower edges. He walked the corridor during a midday thaw and noticed minimal dripping. The roof directed water away cleanly. The slats prevented snow from pressing directly against the siding. The air gap allowed evaporation without saturation. Even the smell was different. Dry wood rather than damp earth. Carl leaned over the fence again one afternoon. "You know what the weirdest part is," he said. Daniel waited. "It doesn't even look weird anymore." Daniel glanced around the structure. It had blended into the rhythm of the house. The eye had adjusted. What once seemed excessive now seemed integrated. "Funny how that works," Daniel replied. Carl nodded. "When something works, people stop calling it strange." By the end of February, the firewood stack had reduced but remained substantial. Daniel calculated that he would carry a surplus into spring, something that had never happened before. He stood in the corridor one evening as the sun set lower but lingered slightly longer than it had in January. The slats cast long shadows across the remaining stacks. The air felt lighter. The worst of winter was nearly behind them. He placed his hand against the siding one more time. Dry. Protected. He thought back to autumn, to the laughter, the jokes about cages and fortresses. Now neighbors were measuring distances, asking about slope angles, calculating their own lumber needs. The shed around his house had become a lesson. Not about defiance, not about proving others wrong, but about preparation grounded in understanding. And as the season slowly began its turn toward thaw, Daniel realized something deeper than the savings, deeper than the comfort. His firewood had always been ready, always dry, always accessible. He had removed the struggle from the equation. Winter still came, cold still pressed against the town. But inside his layered shelter, the fight had become manageable, predictable. And in that predictability there was a quiet kind of freedom. The laughter had vanished. In its place was respect, quiet, steady, and growing, much like the wall of wood had once grown around his house. Only now, no one questioned why it stood there. They only wondered why they hadn't thought of it first. By the time March arrived, winter had not loosened its grip entirely, but its authority felt weakened. The days stretched a little longer. Sunlight lingered across rooftops. Snowbanks softened at their edges, shrinking almost imperceptibly with each afternoon thaw. Daniel noticed the change first in the corridor. Where snow had once piled thick against the outer slats, there were now gaps. Meltwater dripped from the metal roof in steady rhythms during the warmest hours of the day. The gravel trench he had dug months earlier carried the runoff neatly away from the foundation. He walked the full perimeter slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, boots crunching lightly over patches of ice. The firewood stack had thinned but remained substantial. He had burned far less than in previous winters. The north wall still stood solid, though the top rows were lower now. The air gap between the wood and siding remained dry, no dark stains, no swelling boards, no soft spots. He pressed his palm to the siding again, not damp. That detail mattered more than he had expected. In past winters, as temperatures fluctuated above and below freezing, moisture would seep into the siding where snow pressed against it. Melt during the day, refreeze at night, expand, contract, tiny stresses that accumulated year after year. This winter, the siding had been spared that cycle. Carl came by one afternoon carrying a small notebook again. "I've been tracking my heating," he admitted without embarrassment now. Daniel leaned against one of the posts. "And? I used nearly a third more than you did this winter." Daniel nodded. He had already guessed as much. Carl flipped through his notes. "I kept thinking maybe you just got lucky with the wind direction or something, but it wasn't luck. No, it was that barrier." Daniel looked down the corridor toward the south side where sunlight filtered through the slats. "It was layers," he said. Carl followed his gaze. "You ever think about how houses used to be built?" Carl asked after a moment. "Thick stone walls, deep window wells, overhangs." Daniel nodded. "Climate shapes design." "And we forgot that," Carl muttered. Maybe they had. Modern construction often relied on mechanical systems to solve problems older builders addressed with structure itself. Add more heat, add more insulation inside the walls, increase output. Daniel had simply stepped back and considered the environment first. Another unexpected benefit had revealed itself over the winter: sound. The corridor muted noise from the street. When plows scraped along the road at night, the sound reached the house softened, distant. Wind no longer rattled the siding with sharp snaps. Even passing cars felt less intrusive. The buffer ones, T just thermal, it was acoustic. Daniel hadn't. T designed it for that, but he appreciated it nonetheless. One afternoon in late March, Mr. Alvarez returned, this time with a tape measure and a more serious expression. "I am planning mine," he said plainly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Good. I measured your corridor width again," Mr. Alvarez continued. 3 feet seems optimal. It worked for me. "And the roof pitch?" "Enough to shed heavy snow outward. Too shallow and it accumulates." Mr. Alvarez nodded. "I'll start in April." Daniel felt no possessiveness about the idea. He did T-guard it, he did T-patent it. He explained every detail openly: spacing between slats, importance of ventilation, keeping wood off direct soil contact, leaving that critical air gap near the siding. If the idea spread, that was fine. Preparation was a competition. As temperatures climbed slightly, Daniel began removing sections of the firewood stack strategically. Not all of it, only what he needed to reduce weight gradually as snow melted and the ground softened. He inspected the posts for movement. None. He checked the roof fasteners. Tight. He walked the gravel trench. Water flowed cleanly away from the structure. He felt a quiet satisfaction not just in the winter success, but in the durability of the build itself. It hadn't shifted. It hadn't sagged. It hadn't failed under heavy snow load. One evening, Mrs. Donnelly stopped him near the fence. "My nephew was a contractor," she said. "I told him about your house. He said it's basically a ventilated thermal buffer." Daniel chuckled softly. "That sounds more technical than I'd put it. But it's right, isn't it?" "Yes." She glanced at her own house, where meltwater still clung along the lower siding. "I wish I'd done something like that years ago." "It is never too late," Daniel replied. By early April, patches of grass began reappearing. Snow receded into shaded corners. The corridor, once enclosed in white, now stood fully visible again. The outer slats had weathered the winter well. The wood stacks that remained were dry and intact. The siding behind them looked almost untouched by the season. Daniel realized something else as he walked the perimeter one quiet afternoon. The structure had changed his daily habits. Fetching wood had been effortless. Monitoring exterior conditions required only a few steps outside the door. Even stepping into the corridor during storms had felt controlled, sheltered but connected. The house no longer felt exposed, it felt layered. Carl joined him that afternoon, leaning against one of the posts. "You know what surprises me most," Carl said. "What?" "It doesn't look temporary anymore." Daniel looked up at the metal roof, then along the slatted wall. It had become part of the house's identity. Children riding bikes down the street no longer pointed. Delivery drivers no longer slowed to stare. The structure had blended into normalcy. "Strange becomes standard if it works," Daniel replied. Carl nodded. "I am drawing plans," he admitted. "Not exactly like yours." but similar. Daniel smiled faintly. Good. Think the town'll look different in a few years? Maybe, Daniel said. Maybe it'll look smarter. Carl laughed quietly. As spring strengthened its hold, Daniel made one final observation. When heavy rain replaced snow, the corridor performed just as effectively. Water struck the outer roof and drained away. The slats prevented splashback against the siding. Airflow dried everything quickly. What had been built for winter proved useful year-round, and that, perhaps, was the most satisfying part. It was a seasonal trick. It was a structural improvement. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the outer wood in warm light, Daniel stood in the corridor and listened. No wind howling, no snow pressing. Just birds returning to trees and distant sounds of thaw. He thought back to autumn, the laughter, the skepticism, the jokes about cages and fortresses. None of that remained. In its place were questions, plans, measurements, respect, not loud admiration, but quiet acknowledgement. He ran his hand once more along the siding, dry, intact, protected, then along the remaining stack of firewood, still seasoned, still ready. His supply had lasted longer. His house had endured better. His effort had paid for itself in comfort and savings and in peace of mind. Winter would come again. It always did. But next year, Daniel would not prepare with uncertainty. He would prepare with experience, and down the street, in garages and backyards, neighbors were already beginning to measure 3 feet out from their own siding, string lines stretching tight in early spring air. The first quiet signs that what had once been laughed at was becoming the new standard. By the time the 7th winter arrived, no one laughed anymore. The shed had become so familiar, so natural against the lines of the old house that newcomers to the road assumed it had always been there. The boards had weathered into a soft silver gray, the same tone as the fence posts and the distant barns scattered across the valley. Moss crept along the shaded side. In summer, vines tested the lower beams. In winter, snow rested evenly along its slanted roof, forming a perfect white ribbon encircling the home. But for Daniel, the man who had built it with blistered hands and stubborn patience, the shed was never just lumber and nails. It was breath, it was warmth, it was quiet proof that foresight outlasts ridicule. That 7th winter came early and hard. October barely had time to turn the leaves before the first deep freeze settled in. The wind swept down from the hills with a sharpness that stung the lungs. Weather forecasts warned of a long, severe season ahead, one of those winters that tested roofs, pipes, and resolve. Daniel had prepared months earlier. By late spring, he'd already begun stacking split oak, maple, a little hickory he'd traded from a farm north of the river. Each piece seasoned properly, measured by feel and sound. When 2 logs struck together, they rang like hollow woodwind notes, clean and dry. He walked the circular corridor of the shed each evening that autumn, inspecting his stacks. The design allowed him to rotate wood effortlessly, oldest in front, newest behind. The airflow through the slatted walls kept everything dry without trapping moisture. Even during heavy rain, the overhang and outer wall shielded the stacks. It was a system. It was discipline. And it meant that when the first snow fell heavy and wet, Daniel did not rush outside in panic. He did not scramble beneath a tarp weighed down by ice. He did not chip frozen logs apart with numb fingers. He stepped through the interior door of the house, crossed directly into the shed, sheltered walkway, and selected his evening as firewood in comfort. The difference between preparation and scrambling is dignity. Across the road, the Harris family learned the difference the hard way. In late November, an ice storm rolled through unexpectedly. It coated trees in glass, bowed power lines under weight, and left much of the valley without electricity. The hum of refrigerators died. Furnace blowers fell silent. Darkness came early and thick. The Harrises relied primarily on electric heat with a small fireplace for emergencies. Their firewood, however, sat stacked uncovered behind their garage, protected only by a thin tarp secured with bricks. The ice storm lifted that tarp like a sail. When Mr. Harris ventured out to gather wood, he found a frozen mound fused together by sleet. The logs were soaked beneath their glaze. He managed to pry a few loose, but they hissed and smoked in the fireplace, producing more frustration than warmth. That night, as temperatures dipped below 20 degrees, Daniel's chimney exhaled a steady, calm plume of smoke. Warm, controlled, certain. Around 9 o'clock, there was a knock on his door. He already knew who it would be. He opened it without surprise. Mr. Harris stood there, collar turned up, breath visible in the porch light. "I hate to ask," he began, pride stiff in his voice, "but do you have a few dry logs to spare, just until morning?" Daniel didn't answer immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he remembered. He remembered the jokes, the half-loud comments when he first built the shed, the casual laughter about building a fort around your own house, the way neighbors slowed their trucks to stare. But memory and resentment are not the same thing. He nodded once. Of course. He led Mr. Harris not around the outside, but through the interior door into the shed corridor. The sheltered walkway glowed under a simple string of low-wattage bulbs Daniel powered with a small battery backup system he de-installed years earlier. Nothing fancy, just enough light to see. Mr. Harris paused, turning slowly. The circular wall of neatly stacked firewood surrounded them in perfect order. "You kept it all dry?" he asked quietly. Daniel gave a small shrug. That was the point. He handed over an armful of seasoned oak, dry as parchment. "Take these, and if you need more tomorrow, come back." There was no lecture, no gloating, just wood. That night, word traveled quickly despite the outage. In small rural communities, stories move faster than electricity. By morning, 2 more neighbors knocked. Daniel shared what he could spare without endangering his own supply. He calculated carefully. He had prepared for 7 months of burning. Giving away a small portion would not harm him. And something unexpected happened. The laughter that had once followed him down the road turned into something else. Respect. The shed, once a curiosity, became an example. When the power returned 3 days later, conversations shifted. Instead of jokes, people asked questions. How did you design the airflow? Did you pour footings? Does it help with insulation too? Daniel answered simply. He showed them the angled outer wall that broke winter wind before it reached the house siding. He explained how the shed created a buffer zone and an extra layer that reduced heat loss from the main structure. He described how snow piled against the outer wall rather than the house itself. The design was genius. It was thoughtful. And thoughtfulness is rare enough to appear brilliant. As the 7th winter deepened, the valley endured record-breaking cold, gas prices spiked. Delivery trucks struggled on icy roads. Heating bills climbed sharply. Daniel stayed almost unchanged. He rose each morning to a house that held its warmth longer. The shed acted like a protective coat, blocking drafts. His fire burned efficiently because the wood was perfectly seasoned and easily accessible. He did not waste energy running outside repeatedly in frigid air. Instead, he walked a few steps, gathered logs, and returned inside. Small efficiencies compound. By January, something else changed. 2 houses down, the Carters began constructing their own version of a perimeter shed. Not identical, smaller, adjusted for their layout, but inspired. Then another neighbor added a partial wrap on the windward side of their home. By spring, the once laughed-at idea had quietly replicated itself across the road in variations. No one announced the shift. No one formally apologized for the early mockery. But change itself is a form of apology. One evening in late February, as a heavy snow blanketed the valley in silence, Daniel stood inside the shed corridor and listened. The wind roared against the outer wall, but inside the circular space there was only a low, steady hush. The air was still. The wood stacks stood firm and dry. The temperature in the corridor was noticeably milder than outside. He placed a hand against the inner house wall, warm, then against the outer shed wall, cold. Between those 2 surfaces lay a buffer of air and timber that absorbed the worst of winter before it ever touched his home. He thought back to the first day he'd begun construction alone, measuring and digging while neighbors watched with raised eyebrows. He had not built the shed to prove anyone wrong. He had built it because he knew what winters were capable of. Preparation is quiet. Mockery is loud. But when the storm comes, quiet wins. Near the end of that winter, another ice storm threatened the valley. This time, though, something was different. The Harrises had built a proper covered rack attached to their garage. The Carters had stacked and rotated their wood carefully. Even families without sheds had invested in better storage. The community had learned. And Daniel felt no ownership over that lesson. He simply felt glad. On the final cold night of March, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. Stars glittered sharply above the frozen fields. Smoke rose gently from chimneys across the road, not in panic, but in preparation. Daniel stepped into the shed corridor one last time before bed. He selected a final log from the winter's oldest stack. The pile behind it was nearly gone, not because he had miscalculated, but because he had shared. He paused at the center of the circle, surrounded by the remaining stacks. The shed no longer felt like a defensive structure. It felt like a companion, something that had stood with him against wind and doubt alike. He ran his hand along one of the beams. The wood was smooth now, worn slightly where his fingers had brushed it 1,000 times. Outside, The valley slept beneath frost. Inside, his home glowed. Laughter from years past had faded into memory, thin and distant as old smoke. In its place remained something stronger: understanding. By the time spring thawed the ground and birds returned to the trees, Daniel began splitting next year. Wood. Not because he feared another hard winter, but because he understood a simple truth that no storm could undo. The shed was never about firewood. It was about thinking ahead when others are thinking sideways. It was about building protection before you need it. It was about standing steady while others watch and waiting patiently for the day they understand. And in the quiet rhythm of splitting logs beneath the warming sun, Daniel felt no need to explain any of it. The shed explained itself.